65,000 years ago, deep in what we now call Maltravieso Cave in Spain, someone stood in the darkness holding red ochre pigment. They placed their hand against the cold limestone wall and blew the pigment around their fingers, creating an image that would survive until this moment. That handprint challenges everything we thought we knew about being human, because it wasn't made by Homo sapiens. It was made by a Neanderthal. For 165 years, since that first skull was discovered in Germany's Neander Valley in 1856, we've told ourselves a story about these ancient relatives. We painted them as primitive brutes, club-wielding, grunting creatures who represented everything we had evolved beyond. Victorian scientists saw their heavy brow ridges and robust features and immediately concluded: primitive, brutish, inferior. Hollywood embraced this stereotype, turning Neanderthals into cartoon cavemen stumbling through the Ice Age with little more intelligence than apes. But in laboratories across the world, scientists have been quietly assembling evidence that shatters this narrative completely. The breakthrough came in 2010, when geneticists achieved what many thought impossible. They successfully sequenced DNA from 40,000-year-old Neanderthal bones. What they found rewrote human history overnight. Modern humans didn't just encounter Neanderthals, we interbred with them extensively. Between 1% and 4% of non-African human DNA comes directly from Neanderthals. In the most literal sense possible, they are family. Those primitive genes weren't evolutionary baggage, they were life-saving adaptations. Neanderthal DNA influences our immune systems today, affects how we respond to pain, shapes our hair texture, and even impacts our sleep patterns. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck, researchers discovered that some of our most important immune responses came from Neanderthal genes inherited tens of thousands of years ago. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they helped us survive the modern world. The genetic revelations were just the beginning. Across Europe, archaeologists were uncovering physical evidence that challenged every assumption about Neanderthal capabilities. In the Grotte du Renne in France, they found sophisticated jewelry made from animal teeth and shells, created 44,000 years ago. These weren't crude attempts at decoration. Each tooth and shell had been carefully perforated, selected for color and symmetry, and strung into what can only be called fashion. This was personal adornment expressing individual identity and group belonging. Then in 2024, archaeologist Pierre Dubois made a discovery that would become central to rewriting the Neanderthal story. Deep in a French cave, his team uncovered the remains of an individual they named Thorin. This Neanderthal lived 42,000 years ago, making him one of the last of his kind in Europe. But Thorin's DNA revealed something extraordinary. He belonged to a lineage that had been isolated from other Neanderthal populations for 50,000 years. According to traditional thinking, this isolation should have led to cultural stagnation. Instead, they found evidence of sophisticated tool technology, symbolic behavior, and complex social organization that had developed independently. Thorin's people were creating composite tools using birch tar adhesives that required heating bark to precise temperatures between 340 and 400 degrees Celsius. This isn't trial and error. This is chemistry. Modern experimental archaeologists struggle to replicate these adhesives that Neanderthals mastered 200,000 years ago. They were engineering spears with precisely balanced weight distribution, knives with ergonomic grips, and cutting tools that remained sharp through extended use. But the evidence of Neanderthal sophistication goes far beyond tools. Along the Mediterranean coast of Spain, at sites like Cueva de los Aviones, researchers found pierced and painted shells dating back 115,000 years, long before modern humans reached Europe. These shells required planning to obtain, coming from beaches miles from the caves. They required technical skill to perforate without breaking. Most importantly, they required an aesthetic sense to select for color, shape, and symbolic meaning. At Gibraltar, Neanderthals were collecting black feathers specifically from birds of prey, not for practical purposes, but seemingly for their symbolic power. They were diving for specific types of shells, modifying them into jewelry, and creating personal ornaments that spoke to individual identity and group membership. This behavior appears across Neanderthal sites from Portugal to the Caucasus, suggesting shared cultural values that transcended local populations. The most profound evidence of Neanderthal humanity appears in how they treated their dead. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, archaeologists found burial sites that speak to grief, love, and possibly spiritual belief. The most famous Shanidar burial was that of an elderly man who had lived with severe disabilities, a withered arm, blindness in one eye, and head trauma that would have required constant care. Yet he survived to old age, cared for by his community, despite being unable to contribute to group survival. When archaeologist Emma Pomeroy returned to Shanidar with modern techniques, she found even more compelling evidence of ceremonial burial. The positioning of bodies was deliberate, graves were marked with stones, and in some cases, evidence suggests mourners returned to tend burial sites. Recent reanalysis of soil samples has reignited debate about whether Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers. But the pattern of plant remains suggests these burials were timed to specific seasons, possibly following ritual calendars. At El Cedron in northern Spain, archaeologists uncovered what may be the most intimate glimpse into Neanderthal social life: the remains of an entire family group who died together 49,000 years ago. DNA analysis revealed they were related: adult males and females, teenagers and children. The positioning of their remains showed adults arranged protectively around younger individuals, suggesting that even in death, family bonds remained paramount. The El Cedron family provided evidence of sophisticated social organization. Isotope analysis of their teeth showed that females had traveled from distant regions to join the group, indicating exogamy, the practice of marrying outside one's immediate community to maintain genetic diversity. This isn't instinctive behavior. This is cultural knowledge about genetics passed down through generations and enforced through social rules. Such complex social organization demands sophisticated communication. For decades, scientists believed Neanderthals lacked the anatomical capability for advanced language, but recent research has overturned this assumption completely. Analysis of Neanderthal hyoid bones shows they had the same vocal apparatus we possess. Computer modeling of their vocal tracts suggests they could produce the full range of human speech sounds. More importantly, their behavior demands language. You cannot teach complex tool-making through gesture alone, coordinate group hunts without communication, or maintain cultural traditions across generations without words. The evidence for Neanderthal language isn't just anatomical, it's behavioral. At Bruniquel Cave in France, Neanderthals arranged broken stalagmites into mysterious circular patterns 176,000 years ago, suggesting shared symbolic understanding that required verbal transmission. At Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, they carved abstract crosshatch patterns into rock faces, deliberate marks that served no practical purpose except to communicate meaning. Across Europe, Neanderthals were collecting unusual stones, fossils, and crystals with no survival value except to satisfy aesthetic or symbolic needs. They were creating what archaeologists call collections, accumulations of objects valued for their beauty, rarity, or meaning rather than utility. This behavior speaks to minds capable of abstract thought, symbolic association, and the appreciation of beauty for its own sake. Perhaps most remarkably, evidence shows extensive cultural exchange between Neanderthals and modern humans during thousands of years of coexistence. Tool assemblages from sites where both populations lived show technological transfer in both directions. Modern human innovations appearing in Neanderthal sites, and Neanderthal techniques being adopted by modern human groups. DNA evidence reveals multiple waves of interbreeding and cultural exchange that created a web of relationships defying simple replacement models. The traditional narrative suggests modern humans outcompeted Neanderthals through superior intelligence and technology, but the reality proves far more nuanced. Genetic evidence indicates Neanderthal populations were always smaller and more fragmented than modern human groups. They lived in family units and small tribes, while modern humans formed larger, interconnected networks spanning continents. Climate change during the last ice age pressured all human populations, but where modern humans could draw on vast support networks, Neanderthal groups faced challenges in isolation. Numbers ultimately mattered more than individual capability. Random genetic drift, local catastrophes, and gradual absorption into growing modern human populations eventually tipped the demographic balance. But describing this as extinction misses the larger truth. Neanderthals didn't disappear, they became part of us. Today, billions of people carry Neanderthal DNA. Recent studies suggest some populations have up to 5% Neanderthal ancestry, affecting immune responses, pain sensitivity, hair texture, and countless other traits. When we mount defenses against viruses, when we feel physical pain, when we grow hair, we're expressing Neanderthal genes. More profoundly, when we create art, care for elderly or disabled community members, bury our dead with ceremony and grief, we may be expressing behaviors that are part of our Neanderthal heritage. Standing in Maltravieso Cave today, looking at that 65,000-year-old handprint, the connection becomes visceral. That mark was made by someone who experienced joy and sorrow, who loved their children, who grieved their losses, who looked at the world with wonder and decided to leave their mark. They mixed pigments with the same care a modern artist takes preparing paint. They felt cold limestone against their palm, held their breath, and blew ochre around their fingers with the same intention that drives us to sign our names, to declare I was here. The person who made that handprint lived in a world of crushing ice ages, massive predators, and constant survival challenges we can barely imagine. Yet they found time and energy to create beauty, to make meaning, to express their humanity in ways that transcend species boundaries. They weren't primitive ancestors struggling toward our enlightened state. They were fully realized humans dealing with their world using intelligence, creativity, and emotional depth that mirrors our own. Recent discoveries at sites across Europe continue revealing Neanderthal sophistication that challenges our assumptions. They were making musical instruments from bird bones, creating abstract art, practicing medicine using knowledge of medicinal plants, and possibly even creating the first known glue by processing tree resins through complex chemical processes. Each discovery forces us to push back the timeline of uniquely human behaviors and acknowledge that consciousness, creativity, and culture are far older than we imagined. The new Neanderthal narrative doesn't diminish human achievement, it expands it. Instead of seeing ourselves as the culmination of evolutionary progress, we can recognize ourselves as part of a deep, rich tradition of human experience stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The capacity for art, the drive to explore and understand, the ability to love and grieve and hope weren't recent innovations. They were ancient gifts passed down through countless generations from our shared ancestors. We spent 165 years defining ourselves in opposition to Neanderthals, using them as a measuring stick for our supposed superiority. The real revelation is that we were never that different to begin with. The things we thought made us special, consciousness, creativity, compassion, were always part of the human story. Neanderthals didn't lack these qualities. They helped define them. Looking at that handprint in the Spanish cave, we're not examining the distant past. We're touching family. We're seeing ourselves reflected in the artistic impulse of someone who lived 65,000 years ago, but shared our fundamental humanity. They faced an uncertain world with courage, created beauty in the midst of struggle, and left evidence of their existence for us to discover and understand. In the end, the story of the Neanderthals is our story, a tale of intelligence and adaptation, love and loss, the endless human drive to understand our place in the world and leave something meaningful behind. They weren't the missing link between animals and humans. They were us, in all our complexity and contradiction, proving that humanity, with all its depth and beauty, is far older and more wonderful than we ever dared to imagine.